We come now for the last panel. We had architecture, we had design, and finally we have the art. The panel now is on non-conformist practices in art, with attending Clare, Barlow, Göksu Kunak, and Mikolaj Sobszak. Are they all here already? Some of them. And this last panel, unfortunately, we are in a huge delay, and so we have to hurry up a little bit because we want to finish at 6 p.m., which means that we try to make it precise and short. Karolina Radenkovic is now hosting this panel, and I may introduce her. She studied art history at the University of Vienna, and she's a co-founder of Bildertage, an association promoting contemporary art. She has worked as a collection manager for the Contact Art Collection and as an independent curator in various institutions in Vienna. Since 2016, she is the artistic director of the art space thinX Salzburg. Just one word to the panel now. We have the time 6 o'clock, and we have then time to move over to Galerie thinX, where then the final lecture from Jack Halberstam and Damon Young will start at 7:30. Edit as planned. Yeah. So I give now the microphone to Karolina. Yes, I put it there for you. Please.
I don't want to switch off everything or something. So yeah, hello, a warm welcome to this last panel of the day. Unfortunately, Niklas Weiss, professor of art history at the University of Salzburg, is unable to attend due to illness, so I have the pleasure to chair the upcoming 60 minutes or less. Just to give you an overview, we will begin with the paper by Clare Barlow, followed by a discussion with two artists you may already be familiar with from the performances yesterday, Göksu Kunak and Mikolaj Sobszak. After that, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions directly, so we don't lose time. So before we start, let me introduce the three participants. Clare Barlow is director of People's History Museum in Manchester, UK. She joined the museum from the Foundling Museum in London, where she was director of programs and audiences. Before, she had worked at other leading cultural institutions and museums, including Science Museum, Wellcome Trust, Tate, and the National Portrait Gallery. In all her work, Clare has placed considerable emphasis on how museums can better engage with themes of identity, justice, and equality. In 2017, she curated the highly acclaimed exhibition Queer British Art, from 1861 to 1967 at Tate Britain. The talk she will give us today has the promising title Seeing Queerly and precedes this exhibition, as I assume. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you.
Maybe I say later the artist.
Can we just...
Can use this to move?
Okay. So good afternoon. Although I come from the People's History Museum, I won't be talking about our collection today. But if you're ever in London or rather in Manchester, which is where we're based, do come and visit. We have the Communist Party archives, we have a vast collection of trade union banners, we have a museum of protest, dissent, and democracy. Today, however, I'm going to be speaking about the myriad ways in which objects can be considered queer. Sort of what counts when we talk about queer art and why does it matter? I'm going to start out, however, by committing what I'm sure is art historical heresy. Come with me on an imaginative journey. Imagine that you are archaeologists from a far, far distant future. You've perhaps arrived on Earth. It might be too much of a stretch to believe that Earth has survived that long. And you're sifting through the remnants of a long discarded civilization. Not much has survived, but preserved in the silt you find some extraordinary sculptures, depictions of beasts long past. They look like this. What could they mean? Later, as you pick through the wreckage, you find some other surprising remnants. Don't ask me how, it's your imagination. But putting them together, you realise with growing excitement that the stone beasts you uncovered earlier were not some random fluke of decoration. On the contrary, you seem to have stumbled on the cornerstone of some ritual, a religion perhaps, or a secular touchstone of the highest importance to the society you were studying. The objects look like this. This is, of course, a joke, and not perhaps a very good one. Maybe when we go on a mental journey like this, we feel cheated. What a gimmicky way to open. Everyone's heard of the death of the author. Maybe this feels like old news. Or perhaps it feels uncomfortable. Who would put the noble heraldic beasts of Mirabel Gardens next to an image of Zurich pride and a trashy queer t-shirt? Or perhaps we wonder who cares. People can think anything they like. It's far removed from the real business of true art history, so it doesn't matter. But doesn't it? We're wired to make connections. As artist and curator Matt Smith has pointed out, curators do it all the time, bringing together objects from the past to tell a story. Smith's groundbreaking Queering the Museum at Birmingham Museums in the UK took this approach. Alongside unique artworks and interventions of materials throughout the galleries, Smith also brought together objects from the museum's own collection to playfully reference queer culture. So this is, of course, a Bears and Otters disco. Smith is, of course, an artist, so perhaps his interventions hold greater legitimacy for us because they are sanctioned through that lens. Often when we talk about queer art, we privilege the perspective of the curator, their identity, their intent. But objects and spaces have long histories, and if we look at those perspectives in the round, looking not just at creators, but also at communities of viewers who've responded to objects and found new meanings in them, other interpretations may come to light. When it comes to queerness, these connections can play an important social function. There's this sort of yearning to find people like us in the past, or traces that remind us that our shared culture and identities have left these echoes that mean we aren't alone. And similarly, how we respond to other people making these connections can be revealing about our attitudes to queerness more generally. What's at stake is a central question. Can we treat queerness as an equal proposition to other straighter interpretations, or does it always need additional evidence, documents proving that a queer interpretation is justified? Another way of phrasing this, do queer interpretations have to carry their papers with them wherever they go? Or can we accept them as full citizens in our discussions, welcomed alongside other approaches? This is not, of course, to deny that other approaches exist. For many, the unicorn decorations of Mirabel Gardens may stay no more than that, and that's not a problem. There's plenty of illustrious histories of heraldry out there. But our hunger to find emblems, to see histories, to make connections, however stretched, both across time and across space and now with each other, is a powerful force, and one with its own history. I'm now going to take you back in time, this time to the trailblazing LGBTQ+ histories of the 1980s and the 1990s, a project that's been described by many scholars as a project of reclamation, of sifting through the past for these figures, figures whose sexuality or gender identity we can identify as being recognisably queer. There's a wealth of figures to choose from. I'm showing here a work by Simeon Solomon. He's a member of the 19th century Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. He was caught having sex with a man in a public toilet, prosecuted, and spent the rest of his life in and out of lunatic asylums. The work has a queer theme. It shows sad love looking on as his former lover gently disentangles their hands and turns to a heterosexual union. Now, this is perhaps the gold star queer object, an image by a queer creator exploring a theme that feels relevant to queer experience. And of course, there's many contemporary examples that you could see in this light. This is advertisement homage to Benglis from Cassel's incredible project, Cuts, a Traditional Sculpture, in which Cassel's gained 23 pounds of muscle over 23 weeks. It's an image from right at the end of the project, from a series of photographs that Cassel's collaborated on with makeup artist and photographer Robin Black. And like many images in the project, it can be read as a sort of meditation on our incredible potential to reshape our bodies, to reclaim space, and to put ourselves out in the world. But it's an advertisement, both references Benglis's advertisement that she took out in a magazine showing herself with a double-headed dildo. But it's also, I think, plays with the idea of an advertisement as presenting something as being worthy of envy. And there's, like with many of Cassel's works, there's obviously a political agenda behind that. So works that explore some of these experiences can be groundbreaking. But just confining our discussion to images of queerness to these kinds of objects puts us constantly in this position of litigating the sexuality of a creator, or for asking what experiences count as queer. Fortunately, this discussion of art and queerness can't be restrained in this way. And I say fortunately because if you take this legalistic approach, you can end up with very heated debates over this question of who counts. What about figures for whom there's limited evidence? So this is Evelyn de Morgan's The Sea Maidens. De Morgan was married to ceramicist William de Morgan, all very apparently heterosexual so far. But de Morgan's muse and repeated subject in paintings was Jane Hales, nursemaid to her sister's children, who lived in a de Morgan household. Evelyn painted her again and again and again and again and again and again, often nude, sometimes bound, and sometimes in some quite ecstatic poses. And when I say again and again and again, all of the women in this painting are Jane Hales. What to make of this relationship? The litigators might dismiss it in an act of bi-erasure, that heterosexual wedding certificate trumping however many paintings. And of course, the nude is an academic subject, which many artists painted at the time, even if not with quite the same fervour. However, if Evelyn and Jane had been in a relationship, this wasn't necessarily as unusual as the litigators might have us think. Relationships between women in the 19th century were not always fully dismissed. The law was never against them in the same way. And there's a few prominent examples, like that of Mrs. Benson, married to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who used to lie in bed with her female lover and read religious poetry together. Not one of my lesbian life goals, I have to say. Whether or not Evelyn and Jane had sex, there's clearly an erotic charge to some of Evelyn's depictions. And it's perhaps worth noting that on Jane's death, she's buried in the De Morgan family plot, and when Evelyn dies, she's buried in the grave next door. So far, so complicated, but it gets more complicated. In a pre-sexology world, before categorizations of gender and sexuality have quite the same, are quite as well known, many people take approaches which are very unique. This causes different headaches for the litigators who want individuals to be tied to a recognizable contemporary label, what we might think of as the stay-in-your-box approach. So one example of this is an example of some jewellery that belonged to Michael Field. Michael Field was also two people, Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper. They lived together, loved each other, and occupied a shared identity as Michael Field, even writing a journal together under that name. Sometimes they are Edith and Catherine. Sometimes they are Michael and Field. Sometimes they are Michael Field. Their friends sometimes address letters to them as the Michael Fields. It's a relationship that confounds many norms of gender and sexuality, and it's very deeply queer, even if almost unique. They write highly suggestive poetry, and they inscribe interlocking wedding rings on the frontispiece of their published editions as a sign of their everlasting union. But I'm perhaps already falling down the trap of addressing the litigators of queerness on their own terms. Queerness in this reading becomes closely tied to physical, verifiable acts, whether of sex or gender expression. And it's as if we need to hide under the bed, torch at the ready, to jump out and catch people in the act, whatever that act might be. Where I think it can get even more uncomfortable for some critics, and where it certainly got uncomfortable for some of the reviewers of queer British art, the exhibition I did at Tate, is where queerness strays out from beyond the boundaries of the explicit. Take, for example, Tea with Sickett. Here, Edith Sands depicts her lifelong partner, Nan Hudson, sitting across the tea table from their friend Walter Sickett. The mood is quiet and domestic, no flesh on display, no pining, just a happy relationship between two women who loved each other very deeply and shared each other's lives. Some critics really bristled at the idea of what they described as boring lesbian interiors, which they felt had no place in an exhibition with a racy title. But why aren't such works seen as queer? What does it say if we view queer lives, queer experience, and ultimately queer people through this lens, where we feel they have to be wearing a Pride t-shirt or perhaps a strap-on before we deem them queer enough to capture our attention? Another example, Dora Carrington's portrait of Lytton Strachey. Dora had relationships with men and women. Strachey's orientation was almost exclusively towards men. But for each other, they were the person who really understood each other, and that partnership between them was a really powerful force in both of their lives. This is a work about queer community, friendship, and care. Of course, expanding our view in this way doesn't cut against the idea of biography being one component of how an object can be queer, but it expands the range of subjects that sit under that label. And of course, biographical evidence of this sort that is often sought by the litigators remains comparatively rare, which is hardly surprising, no matter how much we might want there to be letters saying, you and me last night in the shrubbery, this is what we did, this is what it means to me, this is who I am now, we'll often struggle to find them. I would point out, however, that these absences of sources apply equally to straight couples. If we were only to discuss heterosexual desire when we had proof of specific acts, we'd find our discussions to be very limited. Perhaps partly because of this lack of readily available sources, many queer people have taken matters into their own hand and said, to hell with the creator, this work looks queer to me. Oscar Wilde famously, and perhaps somewhat performatively, fainted in front of Guido Reni's portrait of St. Sebastian, and it's kind of easy to see why. Not all responses are as melodramatic. When Wilde's contemporary, Graham Robertson, stood in front of Walter Crane's Birth of Venus, he burst out laughing and said, "But my dear fellow, that's not Aphrodite, it's Alessandro." He wasn't wrong. The model for Venus was Alessandro de Marco, one of the most famous male models of his day. There's no deeper queer significance behind this choice. On the contrary, Walter Crane painted Alessandro because apparently Mrs. Crane wouldn't let him paint female nudes. It's hard to think of a rationale that's more robustly heterosexual than that. But in the hands of Robertson, it becomes this delicious joke that allows him to hint at his own queer identity. Still, he carries on when telling the story, "She was a fine slip of a boy, and in the warm Italian sunshine passed for Venus well enough." These comments perhaps take on a slightly more sinister tone in the context of late 19th century male desire. where exploitative erotic photographs of Italian youths by artists such as von Glurden were in common circulation amongst men of Robertson's circle. But regardless of the undercurrents, Robertson's comments are still noteworthy as a way of bringing queer desire into view, an act of sharing for those with the knowledge to interpret it. This process of revealing and concealing, picking up and responding to threads of a culture that are not immediately apparent, is of course rooted in a very privileged culture. It's conditioned through a lens of inner knowledge that you need the sort of education and the connections to have. But it also sweeps up a wider circle of men who are often, the lovers or other connections of the people who are making these kinds of connections. And I think regardless of, how critical we might feel about that culture and about that privilege, there is something quite interesting about our attitudes to it. This is a game that many artists play in. Take, for example, Frederick Lord Leighton's The Sluggard. It's hard not to read queer desire in the very languid body of the youth, but the impression is perhaps confirmed if you know that the pose is taken from Michelangelo's Dying Slave, at a time when Michelangelo's own desire for men was becoming better known. And it's a work which other artists have referenced, again as one of these sort of touchstones for a shared game of queerness. So here it is in a work by Robert Mapplethorpe. Now, for many, Mapplethorpe is the quintessential queer artist, famous for his explicit depictions of desire, but even he's not been immune to queer erasure. Interpretations where discussion of the inherent queerness of a work is curiously absent. Take Mapplethorpe's Snake Man, which I encountered in an exhibition in 2018, just after Queer British Art. And then take the interpretive text. The obsession for beauty and perfectionism of Robert Mapplethorpe has inspired the painting of a man wearing the mask, which reflects the photographer's passion for Hellenistic and Mannerist art. It's hard not to raise an eyebrow at this. Mapplethorpe had many passions, and Hellenistic and Mannerist art might well have been two of them. But it's also hard to look at this image and not address the elephant, or perhaps more accurately, the giant snake in the room. So this takes us to another problem, that even when we have incontrovertible proof of acts, we have clear knowledge of biography, sometimes discussion of queerness isn't welcome. Personally, because of experiences I had while curating Queer British Art, I think of this as the Francis Bacon problem. Bacon's Wrestlers are an incredible series of paintings, and there's many ways to interpret them. Scholars accept that the poses are taken from Edward Muybridge, but they're also profoundly influenced by the vast numbers of physique magazine that Bacon had lying around his studio. Now, queerness was recognised at the time. In 1967, the police raided the Institute of Contemporary Art in London because of a complaint that the images were obscene. Yet when I proposed putting one in Queer British Art, it clearly hit a nerve. Another curator, whose name and institution will forever remain nameless, phoned me up during the exhibition's development to say that while Bacon was undoubtedly gay, his work was an eternal genius that transcended biographical specificity. A similar attitude was held by many owners of works that I wanted for the exhibition and requested as loans, which then got declined on a number of flimsy pretexts. I have to say, the problem of having a genius too universal to be considered queer is one that mainly seems to afflict gay male artists, or perhaps more accurately, their devotees. Lesbian artists, as mentioned before, tend to be depicted merely as too boring, and trans artists as too niche for such grand claims. Sadly, the hierarchy of art history often seems to relegate queerness to a lowly position, the equivalent of a well-meaning community outreach exhibition that's staged in the basement of a museum, away from the true business of art history. Queerness in this view is a limitation which true art transcends. Even more sadly, this approach is often enshrined by the art market in prices. As several contemporary artists and dealers have sheepishly told me, queerness doesn't sell. Yet these pressures make it ever more important that we bring queerness to light, that we encourage audiences to feel empowered standing in front of works and to say, to paraphrase Graham Robertson, well, that looks very queer to me. This is important. If we let the litigators or the forces of capitalism drive the discussion of queerness from the marketplace of ideas, then we're saying to queer artists, queer people, queer communities, you're on your own. I'm reminded here of Isaac Julian's Looking for Langston, an elegiac reclaiming of Langston Hughes as a gay black man. Julian made the film in 1989 at the height of the AIDS crisis, and in it, memory, history, and contemporary relevance intermingle in one affirming articulation of blackness, queerness, desire, lost connections, lost spaces where queerness happened. As Julian's work hints, queerness is not just a way of describing an individual. It's also an articulation of a network of relationships, of communities that stretch outward in our own era and backwards across time. And affirming the existence of community has never been more important. We live in a time when it moves afoot to exclude trans and non-binary people from public spaces. In the UK, this is taking the form of excluding them from most public toilets. Once again, I hear those forms of arguments that I used to hear back in the 1980s and 1990s, that queerness is a new phenomenon, and one that if everyone shut up about it, would go away. In this context, it becomes ever more important to explore the ways in which, not just that we've been here, but also this space is ours, and that we have an equal right to interpret it, to move through it, and to leave ghostly traces of our presence for future generations to find and connect to. How we do that is up to us. With that in mind, I'd like to end with a quote from Felix González Torres, discussing how to make queer work in a time of censorship. And I warn you, it's quite a long passage. There's this great quote by the director of the Christian Coalition who said he wanted to be a spy. I want to be invisible, he said. I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know until election night. This is good. This is brilliant. Here at the left, we should stop wearing the fucked up t-shirts that say vegetarian now. No, go to a meeting and infiltrate, and then once you are inside, try to have an effect. I want to be a spy too. I too want to be the one who resembles something else. We should have been thinking about that long ago. We have to restructure our strategies and realize that the red banner with the raised fist didn't work in the 60s and it's not going to work now. I don't want to be the enemy anymore. The enemy is too easy to dismiss and attack. The thing I want to do sometimes with some of these pieces about homosexual desire is to be more inclusive. Every time they see a clock or a stack of paper or a curtain, I want them to think twice. I want them to be like the protagonist in Repulsion by Polanski, where everything becomes a threat to her virginity. Everything has a sexual mission. The walls, the pavement, everything. And the image I've just put up is Felix González Torres' untitled Perfect Lovers, which is two clocks which are installed perfectly synchronized. Expressions of queerness in art can be many things. They can be the raised fist or the abstract gesture. They can be mischievous, explicit, and at times perverse. They can even exist only in the eye of the beholder. But in embracing this contradictory, unruly, playful, and unstable category of objects, we are perhaps also creating space for contradictory, unruly, and playful ways of living. Thank you very much. And this is from my museum.
Thank you, Claire, for this wonderful dialogue and your lecture. Yeah, okay. Sit down. So, are there any direct reactions to that what we just heard? Or should we keep on and then discuss it together? Okay. So maybe now I introduce is it very loud? Okay. And now I introduce Göksu Kunak to you. Okay.
Before I forget a word or something like that. Translation.
So, Göksu Kunak is an artist, researcher, and writer based in Berlin. Her interest lies in chronopolitics and hybrid texts that deal with the performative lingos of contemporary lifestyles as well as non-Western, unorthodox dramaturgies. Recently, she has been working on score-based performances and installations that focus on simulacrum and muscle as an object, body as sculpture. And I will also introduce our second artist, Mikolaj Sobszak, an artist based in Warsaw and Berlin and Düsseldorf. Painting combined with video performance through interdisciplinary collaboration with historians, activists, musicians, and poets is the core of his research-based practice. His work challenges cultural and linguistic norms and reimagines histories erased from so-called official memory. So I will give you now the mic to maybe say something about your artistic practice. First, Göksu.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you, Claire. I was thinking about also in relation to what you just talked about in terms of certain bodies in heteronormative structures, which is actually a street, a building, like a toilet, or wherever we are. And my approach also comes through the idea of camouflage, so to say, not in the sense of figure and ground relationship, but in the sense of becoming another sometimes, and playing with the intensities of the street. This also comes from one research that I did for a piece called Acayip Mahlukat, which is based on 13th century Persian book by Kazvini, and the original name is Acayip Mahlukat in Persian, and in Turkish is Acayip Mahlukat. And if you look at, it's a theological cosmology book, but it also talks about genies, naked people on the trees, quote unquote, very queer bodies and beings and shapes in this book also. And it was immediately translated into Ottoman, and also within the Turkish modernization it was translated into Turkish. Interestingly, in 2019, Erdogan wrote a foreword for this book, even though they're like literally the characters are very non-binary, quote unquote trans, or like the nakedness and the body types that Erdogan wouldn't like to allow on the streets, or in his own understanding of what a Turkey should be, for instance. And in the foreword, he is talking about the importance of this book in relation to the neo-Ottoman, newly structured worldview that he has, which I found very interesting, because if you look at the reality in Turkey, queer beings, queer folks, or any kind of opposition, it's very hard to walk on the streets. And if you talk about against him, you just actually sometimes whisper even on the streets. So this really created this idea, this notion of, reminded me the notion of taqiyya in Islam. I grew up strictly Muslim until a certain age, and my grandmother was telling me this notion, and it's also the basis of jihadism, but right now is used in a very different way, which means quote unquote, Allah says if you are in danger, you can pretend to be a Christian, or you can even take drugs, or you can become someone else or something else, but your belief is important. So I was kind of, for one piece called also Acayip Mahlukat, I was taking this notion and thinking about borders, shape-shifting yourself, and also the power dynamics around the bodies to force you or to prevent you from your own becoming. or using certain ways of being as a hacking system in places. And this one is, these images are from Tangerine. The first version I did at KW, Kunstwerke in Berlin. And the second version was yesterday at Film26. And this piece is also about power dynamics in relation to, what a certain power structure says you to do, and at the same time how you not retake, there's a different word for that. Redefine what is the given space for yourself. Or also we were looking at one painting, I should have sent that to you. The paintings that, for instance, with Felix and I, we were reenacting some paintings. Oh, not these ones, but yes, these I can also talk about actually. But there's one scene that I reenact with, tableau vivant scene that I reenact with performer Felix Baer. The idea is about the tension between bodies, like a gesture of, for instance, Paul Virilio talks about the idea of a fist. A fist can be just an object. A fist can be also a very dangerous object if you put force in it. It can demolish something with a certain speed. At the same time, a caress can be like a love object or a care object, but if it's a rape situation, it can be also a very dangerous, loaded act. So it's also about this: what is seen is never what it is, or what a moment of tenderness can immediately turn into a unnecessary power dynamic that is imposed on you, which also comes from borders and especially within the confinements of how to use certain spaces, which also includes freedom of movement. And here, for instance, there are certain drawings that I did. This is this flag on the right side. On the right side, it's Zeki Müren. He never came out publicly, but he was always cross-dressing, and it was very well known that he was a homosexual, but it was never, he's like from the 50s on in Turkey, he made a very good career, quote unquote, despite his very feminine presence, because he was very talented. And on the left, Bülent Ersoy, she is the first openly public transgender woman, trans woman, and she was first sent to exile from Turkey, and then afterwards she was accepted back, and she's still a very important person. Unfortunately, nowadays she's aligned with Erdogan, so a lot of queer people in Turkey is against her right now, but back then she did very important things for the queer community in Turkey. So this is a kiss in the 70s that they, at a party, they just kissed, and the next day they had to give a public apology because of the kiss that appeared in the newspaper. And there is this hyper-real muscular body is from one of the first monuments in Turkey, Ankara, where I grew up. It's for Güven Park Anıtı, which means the trust park. And the Turkish modernization was a mixture of Western modernism and capitalism, but also very influenced by Soviet workers' culture. And this monument that was also done by actually Russian sculptor, I forgot his name, but there are certain muscles, it's a hyper-real sculpture, because there are certain muscles that really doesn't exist in the body. And it's really like almost like an anime, but it's from 1920s. There is the image of Psychosis from the film Possession. Sorry, there is the image of Isabelle Adjani in Psychosis from the film Possession, where she really loses herself because of the pressure of the society and her lover. And Also, it is well known that after the scene, which she really got herself into it, Isabella Adjani apparently had to take serious therapy, and also the director had to stop the filming. And there's a sad Bugs Bunny, and there are these women who are tied, like quite sexual imagery, which can be, of course, depicted. Again, the same thing can be something that is for pleasure, or something that can be something that is done from a very straight heteronormative, not heteronormative perspective. So there are those layers, but at the same time, not only with the imagery, but with how much time do I have? I should cut it now. Okay. Yeah, okay. So also this one is from last week. It's called Attention. It's the version 3 of a film, 3 of a performance. Started with Hungry, and then Solitude, and that was Attention. It's also about architecture, space, and also queer bodies in space. Bilgesu Akyürek was also doing the pole dancing part again. And yesterday, for instance, the way we use pole is not about the pole dance itself, but it's about the kinetic sculpture and a body hanging in space, sometimes also adding the elements of pole. And Buğra, Büyük Şimşek, and Felix Baer, they were reenacting certain scenes of Jeff Koons and Cicciolina, and also mixing it with certain geometric shapes and body configurations of Valley Export on a car. I use cars not because they are fancy, but because of the car culture in Turkey, masculinity, as well as the German car lobbyism in Turkey and the history of immigration in relation to car culture in Turkey. And on the right, this is in front of Neue National Gallery. I will say it and I will cut it. I used a very fast BMW sports car, but I put it on a platform, and the car could only go up and down, couldn't go further. And I tied a bodybuilder, and to cut it very short, like it looks like this very masculine, very hyper-real or like very fancy image, but behind it the idea was that, the confinedness of the society or the power dynamics, or you can have so much power within your motor or within your body or whatever it is, but there are certain dynamics that are imposed on you that you can also just like completely lose your I forgot the word. Yeah, I don't want to say power, but I wanted to say have another word, but lose your power or like your ability to make things happen. And this was also like a very, very indirect thought on immigration processes and how in the visa structure, refugees, or how within the apparatuses can really just make you lose your own abilities, even, or like the way you can even walk on the street. I just cut it very shortly, and thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction, Claire, and thank you for having me. And also thank you very much for this festival. Actually, how much I learned during this couple of days is incredibly, I will not say empowering, but very arming. I felt that I have weapons that help me survive next many years of my very long life. However, why I'm saying this, because as a child growing up in Poland, in this Eastern European tradition with very strong Western influences. I was born in 1989, so of course everything what was Western was beautiful and great, and everything what was East European was terror, propaganda, communism, bad, delete. And in television, in church, in all those cultural elements that I was growing up with, the gay character was mostly a comedic episode, someone who is here to just release this binary melodrama tension between women and men in love. So usually it was very bonded figure in crazy costume with some broche and doing some drama. Everyone was laughing, and then we had a real story, the real love. So I kept my sexuality secret till the age of 25, because I really, in my head, to be gay meant to not be serious, to be automatically, by this coming out, being put in the role of a clown, or saying more sophisticated, a jester. And today I see this oppression as a great privilege that allow us, queer people, speak about very heavy political topics with absolute specific humor and lightness that many other artists maybe don't have a chance to, I will use the word, penetrate because of their identity. So for me, also very important as an artist having this experience of growing up in this specific culture is to work with something what we nowadays call queer story. So the history seeing through the queer lens or the lens of LGBTQ plus individuals. And sometimes seeing how much work and passion me and people that I collaborate with, historians, for example, put into this queer story and bringing those stories and trying to make publishings, how much effort we invest in and how little change we observe politically. For example, the same-sex marriage in Poland is still illegal, and it seems that it will not be legal for a long time. That's why such initiatives like this festival is extremely important for me to be also here, and I recognize it as really a privilege. And I would love that kind of thing is happening also in the Eastern European context. So why actually we are doing all of this knowing that the impact is so small, that the politicians only hear us when it fits their agenda before voting, before election? And the answer is because we create the continuity that queer people haven't had. I didn't know that some artists like Francis Bacon are queer, actually. I just saw his painting as a child. I was fascinated. Now I know why I was attracted to it. But I didn't have these keys to unlock this knowledge. That's why the working with queer story, bringing all those historical events, showing not only that, you know, there were workers' strike and 5 people were queer taking part in the protest. No, that we were always part of the major history elements. We took an active part in changing the society, and we did it because our lifestyle was not regulated by the culture. We needed to invent for ourselves what actually marriage is, because we couldn't go to church and get married, and like, who wears the white dress, for example. So we needed to invent how we live, how we have sex, how we raise children, what we do with animals, if we want to have a dog or a cat or a pet, whatever. That's why so many of queer identities formed and shaped the revolution in our culture. And knowing this and having this continuity, even if you want to reject it or work with it, but it is there. And that's how I see my mission. And that's why also my practice is so much based on collaboration with theoreticians like historians or writers, authors, because without this co-work, we will never reach this continuity. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really a good summary of the whole program, maybe even. And so, are there some questions from the public here?
Can I just respond to that?
Of course.
It's fascinating that you say that you didn't know that Francis Bacon was gay, and this is one of the problems, I think, coming at it from an art history background as opposed to coming at it from perhaps a queer theory background or, you know, one of these other disciplines, that there is a lot of resistance to telling queer stories in relation to our material. And with Bacon, it is the universal genius problem, that everyone just kind of assumes that if you talk about the biography, you're in some way debasing the work. But what does that say about where we're putting queerness in our value system, that we see describing a work through that lens as a debasement? And this was something I encountered again and again and again when putting the exhibition together, this idea that you can't possibly mean X, insert name of a famous artist here, when you're talking about queerness. Queerness must be the other. It must be something that isn't already there on the walls of the gallery. It must be something strange. It must be something that isn't part of our shared culture and frame of references. And I think that's fascinating, this idea that you have to kind of shove it in a box in the corner. It can't be something which we value.
First of all, Mikolaj, congrats on your show at the Kunstverein. I mean, your works are strikingly figurative, and especially in the context of your anti-fascist reading last night. I'd like to know what draws you to that figurative way of depicting all those narratives, especially when we know that like fascism has a quite unique visual past when it comes to that kind of depicting stories, narratives.
I can say also about the mic, but maybe exactly, I thought so. For online viewers, I just said that I can say without the mic, but I cannot. What drives me mostly to the figurative aspects is, of course, the heritage that I grew up and I was inculturated with. At the beginning, I really wanted to reject this heritage. I found it as oppressive, and the heritage that locked me in the prison of unknowing open secrets. But then I realized that this is the language that actually my subconsciousness was taught with, so I cannot really escape it. So I need to start to become a friend with it, even though it is really sometimes hurtful. But I took this genre of historical painting, which were very dominated by winners, those authoritarians, regimes that wanted to rewrite their ideologies using the historical events and how they are portrayed to reshape our history. I don't want to say like put people who were erased from it, because, you know, we are putting ourselves into history and we were always there. And I just want to maybe put a little bit more light into it. And what is for me the most important is to crush the binary of seeing. So when you go to Louvre or whatever and you see the historical painting, the light is on Napoleon crowning himself or Josephine. That's where you should look at. And I'm telling you, I don't know where you should look at. You don't know yourself where you should look at, because the culture always tells you where. That's why all those wavy images that are figurative, I think that they are read as an abstraction, that you kind of don't know what you are looking at. Is it a historical event or many historical events? And this crushing the tradition of seeing and putting onto it a queer lens of you make yourself the story, you write history for yourself, taking all those references, is really the core of my practice or my dream, maybe.
So one last question, please, and then we will move on.
Hi. Thank you all for being here, first of all. I wanted to ask, were you able to bring your performances in your countries? Like, do you see, I mean, I think it's important to bring your messages to, it's a controversial, so did you manage, or are you planning to, or what is, yeah.
Is the question for Göksu?
For
both?
Yeah, for both, yeah.
I did one exhibition with 2 paintings, sculptures, certain prints, and a performance last year in Istanbul. I had to change certain clothings, and we had to have meetings on censorship with the gallerist. Of course, he was also like, hey, I really don't want to censor you at all. But there's a reality that because in people it happens, people come to galleries with sticks and things like that. It really happened, by the way. So he was also concerned, and we talked about, okay, maybe shall we ask people not to take imagery, but then, okay, there are 2 other openings in the building, we cannot police people, this is also not what we want to do. But I then made certain imagery according to that, and there was one image that I was using with the Turkish flag and the female, because the exhibition was related to a scandal that occurred because of a car crash, and it's understood that it was related to the corruption of the first and last, unfortunately, female prime minister. And there was an image, collage image that I did, and we searched, and it was actually not okay to use it. I could have gone to jail, so I changed the imagery also. I did just cuttings. But of course, I mean, like, there are also a lot of very open-minded people in Turkey. You just have to know your ways, which is also, I think, again, coming back to the coming out in Turkey, in queerness, like, it's something that you always have to come out. Is it a Western notion, or can you also just, because in the Middle East it's been always like certain things were there also. But yes, of course you can bring it, but not in the way I would do it in Europe. Also, the way I walk is a little bit different there and things like that. Yeah.
When it comes to me, I did a lot of performances in Poland and exhibitions. At some point, when the government was ruled by the right-wing party PiS, it was really hard to exhibit in the public institutions that were taken over by the party members. So we created together with friends some form of a self-efficient institution that now functions mostly as a private gallery. It was called Polana Institute, where we were renting abandoned spaces in Warsaw city, for example, a forming wedding dresses saloon, and we're organizing the shows that we were thinking that they were very needed, mostly around the feminist and queer topics. Of course, the money that we were getting to organize those shows, and also like a small residency for curators and researchers, was from the selling art pieces. That's why I say that nowadays it functions exclusively as a private gallery. And when it comes to the memory-making institutions, like for example the museums that are working with memory on Holocaust, when we proposed a show that was talking about queer victims of Holocaust, intersexual persons, not only homosexual men, then we got from one museum, I will not say now because we are suing those 2 institutions right now, so I cannot reveal the name, but one institution responded to our mails constantly with a phrase, "We really appreciate your work, best wishes." And the other work appointed the publication where the texts were written and illustration by me were done. And in the moment when the publication is supposed to be public, they cut the contract and they said that the project never existed. So we will see how it will go. Probably this trials needs to happen, but yeah. So when it comes to the official memory and writing it, it's tough. When it comes to self-organized things, it's interesting, yeah.
So thank you to you all for being here. I would say now we move to 5020 directly to hear the keynote from Jack Halberstam with the response of Damon Young, and then also see the performance of Ben Girard and Tati O'Meal. Thank you a lot, and we see us at 5020 in half an hour, if you go quickly.